and welcome to Cut Through, Crikey's spin-free analysis of Australian news, politics and power. I'm your host, Crystal Andrews, and firstly, a very quick announcement. Next month is the 20th anniversary of the Crikey End of Year Awards, and we are currently calling for nominations in two categories: Arsehat of the Year and Shitstirrer of the Year. So if you have an Australian public figure who you think absolutely deserves to win either one of those awards, I encourage you to click the link in the episode description and send in your nominations. I very much look forward to seeing who you all think should get the top honours this year. And for today's episode of Cut Through, I am joined by Crikey's political brains, Bernard Keane and Rachel Withers. What a treat to have you both on the show today.
Thank you for having me. And as I was saying to Bernard just before, first time we've ever actually spoken, which is crazy.
Yeah, readers might think we cunningly workshop everything together, but not a bit of it.
Yes, there is no collusion on any of their takes. Not that I don't think anyone would have expected that would be the case. But I'm very, very glad to have both of your opinions with us today. We are going to be looking at the year that was, because we have made it essentially to the end of the parliamentary year. The work of legislating is done for 2025, which makes it, of course, the perfect time for us to reflect on what has been a very big year in politics and policy. I'll give a very quick recap on the numbers first. Since the election, we've had around 75 bills initiated in the House of Reps and about 20 in the Senate. Approximately 30 of those bills have been passed, including some of the big ones that our listeners may have been following. That one-off 20% reduction for students' university help debts, which was, of course, Labor's big election promise that they executed quite quickly. There was also Baby Priya's bill, which protects employer-funded parental leave payments in instances of stillbirth. There was the establishment of a permanent Centre for Disease Control, protection for penalty rates, reform to the Aged Care Act, strengthening regulations for childcare centres, and updating the criminal code to allow the designation of foreign state entities as sponsors of terrorism. Now, the numbers on all of that might be a little imprecise because everyone should know that at the time of recording, we haven't quite finished the final parliamentary sitting week. So there's still a little bit to go, some of which we'll talk about in the conversation coming up. But I think it gives a good sense of what has been achieved by this 48th Parliament so far. So my first question to you both is, what is the one bill or piece of legislation from 2025 that you think sort of sums up where Australian politics is at right now? It doesn't have to be something that's passed. Maybe it's something that failed or is still kind of hanging in limbo. Maybe BK, we'll start with your take on this first.
Well, if you take an optimistic approach to politics, which I think is a bit hard currently, but an optimistic approach, you might say that the aged care reforms are quite emblematic of how we're going, in the sense that they are good policy. They receive bipartisan support. Both sides of politics know that aged care is a major work in progress in policy terms, that we're in the middle of a transition to a new system of aged care, which kind of centres much more on home care than traditional residential aged care, and we need to find a way to pay for all that. So in terms of outcomes, and it also reflects the Aged Care Royal Commission from a few years ago, which put in place a lot of recommendations around things like having basic rights embedded in legislative form. So if you're an optimist, you'd maybe pick that out as evidence that the system can actually work. I think I'd prefer to single out the FOI bill as an indication of maybe not where politics is at, but certainly where Labor is at currently, which is in a very complacent, very kind of risk-averse, very amoral kind of position. I mean, this bill really centres around the idea that there is too much transparency and too much scrutiny of the government, and we need to roll that back. And the public justification for rolling it back is robo-debt, which is an extraordinarily offensive exploitation of robo-debt and utterly free of any evidence or logic. And yet the government continues to try to push it forward, and has public servants busily backing up those absurd claims to committee inquiries. And just a little sort of grace note, Remember Dorinda Cox, who defected to Labor during that inquiry into the FOI bill? She was the senator designated to do Labor's dirty work in that. So she spent quite a bit of that time attacking people like the Australia Institute and alleging that they've been, peddling misinformation about the FOI bill. So, if people get the sense that I'm not particularly impressed by this government, they're not wrong. And I think, look no further than the FOI bill to see bad policy backed up by bad arguments implemented badly. And, that's where the government certainly is, if not our general state of politics.
Yeah, look, I mean, I completely agree about all of those points on the FOI bill. I was going to go with, and perhaps it's a recency bias, the environment reforms that are currently before Parliament. And in this final week, we've got Environment Minister Murray Watt really pushing and pointing to the ticking clock about getting these passed, despite the fact he's actually had months and months in this role to do this. It's a classic end of year move. But I think you've got Labor, as with most of its contentious legislation, tossing up between negotiating with the Greens or with the coalition. They've got a choice on every bill. It looks like they'd much rather work with the Greens, which I think, given the coalition stance on net zero recently, it would be crazy to do otherwise. But you have got Murray Watt and Anthony Albanese making noises about going either way. And I think it's worth remembering that we're only here doing this again because Anthony Albanese scuppered a deal at the end of last year on the environment reforms, which had been negotiated between the Greens and then Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek. So I think it also says a lot about Anthony Albanese and the role he plays in politics at this point. He has apparently sat down, it's Wednesday that we're recording this, and he has sat down with the leader of the Greens, Lisa Waters, today. So it's interesting that Anthony Albanese comes in at these contentious points. I think, as we saw last year, he was the block, and presumably this time nothing is going to pass without his sign off.
The two bills provide quite an interesting contrast because, BK, when you were talking about the FOI bill, I was thinking about some of the feedback of our coverage on Crikey that we were kind of getting from readers and also, the general public across social platforms. And there seemed to be kind of a split in how the public was receiving that. Obviously, FOI is kind of a niche topic as well. It doesn't have as broad appeal as something like environmental reform. But, there did seem to be more people than I expected who accepted the government's reasoning that there was like a justifiable cause for those changes. Whereas I think on the environmental reforms, the public reception to what's going on has been far more negative. Labor being so dominant in the lower house feels like it's sort of able to roll the dice on certain things and not others.
I think that it certainly reflects, I suspect the Crikey readership that people have mutable principles around things like transparency. Transparency is a great thing when the other side, when the people you hate are in power. That's when you think transparency is wonderful, and it's an outrage that any transparency might be curtailed. When your side's in power, transparency is just a kind of annoying kind of bug of the system that really needs to be dealt with. But on something like environmental reform, I think there's a narrative that even a lot of rusted on Labor supporters, I think, accept, which is that this government is very unambitious, not interested in reform, certainly not interested in any sort of significant progressive reform, except in a few very safe areas. Its willingness to take any deal it can possibly get on environmental protection, no matter how bad, I think fits with that idea that people do have that, this is not a reformist government. This is a managerialist government. This is a government that is really just focused on staying in power, not about actually using that power to deliver the kind of progressive outcomes that I suspect a lot of, even quite centrist Labor voters, would want to see from a Labor government.
I think on a similar note to that, just in recent weeks, months, I'm losing track of time, but we've seen Labor also back away from the changes on taxes to high super balances, despite these having been kicking around for a couple of years now. And again, it's, Labor has this huge mandate. They have the ability to work with the Greens on the Senate on those reforms. But again, because of Albanese and his approach, they seem to have backed away from the harder bits.
We should put a lot of the focus of this conversation on the Senate. Obviously, the composition of the current parliament means that since the election, the Senate is really where we've seen a lot more of the action and a lot more of the debate, and where the legislation is shaped after it emerges out of that super majority in Labor's House of Reps. Emblematic of that is the environmental reforms, obviously, as we've been talking about. Rachel, it's interesting that you say that you think that they'll work with the Greens, because my money is actually that they will go with the coalition on this. But I guess by the time this episode is out, either one of us will be right on that, and we'll find out.
I hate when parties do this at the end of the year and go, final week, got to get this done. This is so important. This act is so broken and out of date, when it wasn't urgent in the last sitting fortnight or the one before that. Both the coalition and the Greens are playing hardball here, but regardless, I don't think it should be rushed through. This is like 1,500 pages of legislation, and amendments are apparently being presented like yesterday.
Hello, Cut Through listeners. It's Crystal and Rachel from the future checking in now that we have the final update on the long-awaited, much discussed environmental reforms. Rachel, as it turns out, I was wrong. A journalist was wrong.
That's what we get for trying to record this with still 24 hours on the clock of the parliamentary year.
Yeah, I'm taking it very personally that this all got passed at the 11th hour. But ultimately, Labor did work with the Greens after all of that to get the amendments passed through the Senate on the final parliamentary sitting day of the year. The top line is that Labor agreed to remove the ability to fast-track coal and gas applications through the sort of environmental assessment process. There is still no climate trigger. That's definitely been taken off the cards completely. The Greens were able to secure an ending to the exemption for native forestry logging, and adding in powers to stop illegal land clearing. So a bit of give and take on both sides here. You've written a piece about it for Crikey, which I'll link in the episode description as well, so everyone can take a look. But for you, I guess, what does this mean? Does this paint, a different kind of picture of what we've been talking about in terms of that relationship between the Greens and Labor?
Yeah, look, on the one hand, I think it bodes really well. As I write in today's piece, this is how Parliament is supposed to work. The government has a bill and it needs to get the support of the opposition or the Senate, like the minor parties in the Senate, and that's what they've done here. And I think, I think it would have been damning if they had worked with the coalition on this. On the other hand, I think the coalition sort of forced their hand by being completely batshit this week. By the sounds of things, they couldn't even get their list of desired amendments together, according to what the Prime Minister said in his press conference. So I suppose by contrast, the Greens were the only option, and it looks like a fair deal was done with the way things stand. Like, the Greens are the natural party that the government should be doing its negotiations with over its bills in the Senate, until if or when the coalition returned to some sort of like normalcy. There was a few little bits and pieces in the press conference this morning. Clearly, Albanese was praising the Greens for their maturity, and I think that was quite pointed, both at the coalition but also perhaps at what he perceived the Greens were before. You also saw the Greens leadership in Larissa Waters and Sarah Hanson-Young both making a big point of the fact that they are here to get things done, or as Larissa Waters likes to say, get shit done. And so I think there is still like a little bit of a hangover from the federal election and some fear in parts of the Greens that if they look uncooperative, they'll be punished for it.
Yeah, it is sort of interesting to see how both sides are responding to that branding of the Greens. But it does seem like maybe this is the first sign of the Greens in the Senate stepping into that currently vacant opposition role. The coalition is in no way, shape or form a reasonable or functional opposition at all. So, that's how it feels a little bit to me. But as you've pointed out, that there wasn't really a second option. There was no viable plan B.
Yeah, and that's the thing we talked about yesterday. I think either the Greens or the coalition sort of freak out and come to the table if it looks like the other side is moving. In this case, with the coalition not moving at all, that actually, I think, did give the Greens the power to dig their heels in a little bit more, and actually get some serious amendments. And at the end of the day, Labor has to come to the table and agree as well. It can't just be the Greens deciding whether they're going to negotiate or not. It has to be that Labor is also willing to actively negotiate. And I think it's worth remembering that this same bill was almost at the point of a deal. Some would say it was at a deal at this time last year, and Anthony Albanese intervened to scupper that deal. He hasn't done that this time. So, it's up to Labor as well to let a deal be done.
Does this mean, do you think, that it's the beginning of Labor taking a half step towards a more progressive vision of politics and governing than we've seen so far? Or is that a little wishful thinking on my part? We should just take this in a silo as it is.
I think I want to agree with you. It does seem like potentially Albanese is more open to negotiating with Larissa Waters than he was with Adam Bent and Max Chandler Mather, for example, who he clearly didn't like. But I think, again, we'll have to wait till the next issue comes along. I think with something like environment, it is a little bit incumbent on Labor to work with the Greens instead of the coalition, especially with the state they're in. But I suppose when something next comes up to do with gambling or transparency or any of the issues in which they've chosen to work with the coalition over the Greens, we'll see if this pattern actually continues.
And I guess everyone's about to have a bit of a break, a bit of a rest from each other, and might come back with a different plan in mind for 2026. Okay, thanks for the update, Rachel. We will now go back to the rest of the conversation as recorded. Rachel, maybe I'll ask you first. How do you see Labor's dynamic with the other senators? How has it been working with them, and what should readers sort of pay attention to in that regard?
Yeah, look, I think it was such a disappointment for me personally, but for a lot of people, that we didn't end up with the minority government or the hung parliament in the lower house. But the Senate is still hung, as it pretty much always is. And arguably, the Greens actually have slightly more power in this Senate than they had in the last one, because they have the sole balance of power, even after losing Dorinda Cox, as Bernard referred to. But I don't think that Labor has shown any signs of wanting to work more closely with the Greens or, take advantage of massive progressive mandate that this current parliament has. And in fact, I think the fact they have a massive majority in the lower house makes them as bullish as ever in the upper house. It hasn't made much difference to how they interact. I will say that the composition of the Senate has meant that we have hardly heard from Jackie Lambie or David Pocock, because suddenly their votes don't matter. Labor can truly pass things with entirely the coalition or entirely the Greens. And so it has been a bit of a shift, I think, after the last couple of years, not hearing Jackie Lambie's voice on morning radio. David Pocock's still out there pushing things, but he doesn't actually have a lot of influence in this parliament. Pauline Hanson still making lots of noises, kind of pointless noises, in terms of actually getting anything done in Parliament. So yeah, I think we are hearing less voices, but at the same time, we're not really seeing Labor showing any extra willingness to negotiate with the two groups that it can negotiate with. And in fact, I would add that I think the fact that the Greens lost so many seats in the lower house at the election has actually made figures like Murray Watt, current Environment Minister, even more bullish in negotiations, because listeners might know he popped up in the electorate of Ryan this week and kind of strong-armed the Greens in the Senate into passing his legislation, pointing out that, hey, this is the only seat you've got left. So they're very conscious of the way the Greens were perceived at the election, I think, and they want to double down on that.
Is that not risky, though? I mean, we've obviously only had a few months of Parliament this year post the election, but going into next year, if Labor keeps up that attitude of, like, we really don't need to work with you, both the Greens and the coalition could say, well, you do kind of need us, and we can slow things right down. We can just start saying no. Is there a chance that starts to backfire maybe in the new year?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, look, they've shown that they can do that on things like the Environment Bill, but at the same time, I think the fact that there is only, two groups to negotiate with sort of works the opposite way at times. Like one of the first bill to be passed in the current parliament, not the start of the year, but the current parliament, was the cuts to HECS debts, which passed with bipartisan support, even though the Greens would have liked to see it go further because the coalition were willing to fold. So I think if either side there is willing to come to the table, then the other side loses its power entirely.
It's like playing one off against the other. The
Yeah.
Labor can go to mum or they can go to dad.
Yes, and then the other mum folds if dad folds.
Yeah.
And I don't want to be the bad guy.
BK, is that a shift in how Labor was dealing with the other parties in the Senate prior to the most recent election, or is this just like same old behaviour of sort of Albanese's Labor?
I think so we saw in the last parliament that Labor could be very effectively negotiate with the Greens when they wanted to. So there's a big rush of bills that they got through at the end of 2024, and arguably that played a big role in Labor's kind of resurgence in early 2025. I mean, Labor did end the year, I think, with a bit more of a spring in its step than it had previously, and that set the scene for Albanese to come out strongly. So that's a little example of how being able to negotiate stuff through Parliament does actually, can actually sort of have impacts out in the real world. I think since the election, Labor is now much more relaxed about the threat from the left, from the Greens. It's from, I think, from Labor's point of view, it's seen the worst that the Greens can do to them in terms of their vote, and now they're no longer particularly worried about it. They're confident that they've got the Greens measure um, in the lower house, so they don't really see the Greens as a particular threat anymore. Whereas in the previous parliament, I mean, they were constantly getting stuck into the Greens political party, as they insisted on labelling it, and individually targeting uh, Greens figures. So I think there's been a bit of an attitude shift.
I have
So
caught mentions of that a few times post-election, but certainly not anywhere near as much as they were saying it in the lead
yeah,
up.
I think particularly given they decapitated the Greens. I mean, I think Labor's view is, we're not overly fussed about the Greens. So what that means is it frees them up to think purely in terms of their broader strategy, in terms of the coalition. So their strategy around the coalition is, obviously the coalition's always the main enemy. Labor's goal is to marginalise, to paint the coalition as uh, extremists. They want to position Labor firmly in the centre, and um, their parliamentary strategy, I think, is revolves around that, um, much more than the kind of looking to their left and looking to the right kind of strategy that sort of dictated their first term. So yeah, I think that the election result and that big set of numbers in the lower house has kind of shaped how they've approached politics in general, with legislation being a kind of a small dimension to that. And I think one of the things that's kind of that Labor's been particularly pleased about in relation to the Environment Bill is the way that business has really jumped on the back of the coalition to say, pass this damn bill because, hey, we want certainty, and, we want, it's a good indication of how terrible this bill is, that the business community is, so enthusiastic about it, and it's, very, very keen for the Liberals to jump on board and and push it through. But that again plays to this narrative that Labor is the party of the mainstream and the centre. And on the left, it's got these crazies from the Greens. On the right, it's got these extremists from the coalition. And only Australians can only really trust a party that's firmly in the mainstream. That's its kind of broad political strategy, and legislative negotiations, I think, are now kind of a subset of that. Um, there are individual, problems that crop up. As Rachel said, there is no earthly reason why the Environment Bill needs to be rushed through now, except that we've been talking about it for so long. There's a big question mark over, you know, um, just how much of a priority it actually is for this government, and for it to sort of suddenly insist, well, we absolutely have to do this now, while the Senate's actually got, a legit committee process underway. Will provide the opportunity for stakeholders to actually talk about the impacts of this bill, things like the national interest test, the emission of forests, etc., and the absence of a climate trigger. Yeah, that there's no need for there's no need for this rush, but the government clearly sees as part of its broader political strategy the importance of trying to sort of demonise the coalition, and B, paint itself as the only sensible party in politics.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that, about that being like Labor's overarching goal. But I just wanted to add, what a sad major goal to have in a parliament at which you have a huge majority. Your main opposition has been decimated, and you can pass progressive things. And yet this constant focus on how can we make sure we continue to, triangulate to occupy the centre when they were elected as a progressive government with a progressive mandate, and to be still looking over their shoulder and still concerned about staying in power, essentially, for the long term, which is Albanese's goal. Yeah, just what a sad thing to do with the kind of incredible deck they've been handed.
Well, case in point is the superannuation bill. I mean, they went to the election with that bill. They got re-elected with a thumping majority, and then Albanese turned around and said, "Oh, it's too risky. Um, let's chop it back."
Yeah.
Just a real illustration of Labor's priority, which is to basically seemingly not offend a single person, even if they're the kind of person who would never vote for Labor in a million years.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, they're elected while running on those super changes, which had been, sitting there on the books for 2 years, and also on the stage 3 tax cuts backflip, as it was called, that they successfully sold. There is evidence there that they can sell progressive taxation, but despite like a hugely successful election outcome, they don't seem to have much appetite now.
Mm. It might not be a government that's ambitious in terms of reform and progressive ideals that I think most Crikey readers certainly believe in. Do you think that, based on the snapshot that we've seen from the beginning of this parliament, the Labor government will be ambitious in terms of the volume of what it will pass? Are we going to see kind of a volume game as they move into next year and beyond?
I think based on the last couple of months, but I do like the talk of universal childcare that's going on and the potential moves that are being made. And Sean Kelly speaks about this in his latest quarterly essay, but the fact that potentially that might be that might be the centerpiece of this government. It's not a terrible one, and it would make a serious difference in people's lives. But I don't think it's going to be. I don't think it's going to be a quantity government. I could barely recall anything major that passed this year when we first
Yeah, I did have to do some
decided to do this.
some searching.
I was shocked at the numbers you said that had passed.
BK, you don't think that Albanese will have in his mind that he would like to say that he was one of the most productive prime ministers of all time?
No, his goal is to make sure that no one. He wants the whole Albanese project is to increase the level of trust in government. And the first way you do that is you make sure you fulfil all your election promises, except, of course, those that might upset rich people, in which case you kind of back off a bit. But secondly, to make sure that any kind of changes and reforms that he does pursue are, have a lot of support in the community. And clearly, universal childcare. And I would love universal childcare. I am going to be using childcare for a while, so look, bring it on. But I don't think it's the kind of big brush reform that people might be hoping for. It's a reform that is basically spending a lot more money, which is the kind of reform that's not going to upset too many people. But in terms of, there are better ways of delivering, the good things about universal childcare. You can much better target childcare subsidies to, low-income earners, for example, rather than people like me who don't need the subsidies. But there does seem to be a kind of a search for a legacy that's that Labor can talk about in the same way as they talk about Medicare and superannuation and now the NDIS, even though the NDIS is problematic. They always like to talk about what are the big reforms, that we bequeath, and that we want to protect by staying in government for a long period. I think, as it turns out, universal childcare will probably actually have the support of the coalition, at least in one form or another, and not because they're scared of upsetting parents. There's been a kind of a unity ticket on childcare, give or take, for quite some time. Both sides have invested in childcare over the last couple of decades. You can argue the toss over different contributions, but because both sides have been driven by this worry that we don't have enough workers and we need to make women get out and get back to work. And of course, women need to go out and work because we've made the cost of bloody housing so ludicrously expensive that even couples with two incomes struggle to afford it. So, yeah, I think it's a sort of reform that will eventually, when it is delivered, it will come to be seen as a natural consequence of the kind of economy that we actually have. And particularly, all the more so if the kind of natalist debate picks up here in Australia. We do have a very low fertility rate, but if that fertility rate continues to fall like it has been falling, I think at some point governments are going to come under a lot of pressure to sort of think, what can we actually do to stop families from deciding not to have any kids at all, or having fewer kids, or just delaying when they can have kids, because that's going to have real long-term implications for our workforce. I've gone down a bit of a rabbit hole there, but just to say, I think the universal childcare issue is bound up with a much bigger and even more important sort of aspect, which is, how many people do we have in Australia, and what does the shape of our population look like? Not just now, but in 30 years and 60 years.
I just wanted to add in response to a fair bit of that. As you point out, this is about universal childcare is about addressing a much greater question and several questions. And I think one of them, and it's the thing that Labor doesn't show any signs of going near this term, is wealth inequality. It's not just the cost of childcare that is what's stopping a lot of young people from looking at their lives and going, I can't see where children fit into this. It's the fact that they can't afford housing, of sending a child, through multiple years of school. This issue is going to continue to intensify over the next couple of years. And I'm not sure when the Albanese government is going to reckon with it. Things like universal childcare are not going to address the root of the problem, which is that some people simply don't have enough to live, while we're continuing to have tax breaks like negative gearing and capital gains tax discount that mean that the wealthy continue to get wealthier.
From the boy who grew up in social housing, not going near wealth inequality, I think for a certain section of the public anyway, is becoming really too much to bear. But we'll see how that plays out over the coming, next couple of years of Labor's term. I'm going to end with a question, although I have a sense about how this might go, but anyway, I'll put it to you both regardless. Who do you each think won this parliamentary year, if it was something to win? So who do you think came looking out the best? It's going to be very boring if you both say Anthony Albanese. BK, maybe you can have a crack at this one first. Who won the year for you?
Who won the year? Well, look, in parliamentary terms, that's sort of tough. I'll throw in a bit of a surprise. Who won the year? Tim Wilson, just for getting back into Parliament. Through what people say was a very dirty campaign, but nonetheless, the only guy, only Liberal to actually manage to win a metropolitan seat. Who knows if you can hang on to it in 2028? I suspect it'll be quite difficult. That goes to something that we haven't probably really talked about, which is the terrible dilemmas and problems that the Liberal Party find themselves in currently, and I suspect they're going to continue to find themselves in over the long term. For all that I have to say, I'm not a very big fan of Mr. Wilson at all. I think there is a need for moderate Liberals in our Parliament, and more aggressive and more effective Liberal moderates, because the Liberal moderates of recent years have been pretty ordinary. But there is a strong tradition within the Liberals going back over a longer period of moderates who are very effective. And until John Howard came along and basically found a way to basically nobble them and neuter them, they were a crucial part of the Liberal Party. And I don't think we're ever going to get back to that tradition. But if we are going to get back to that tradition, then having people like Tim Wilson, for all his many egregious faults, in Parliament is, I think a good thing. So that's a bit of a bolt from the blue for you.
I can already read the comments. I can see them, that Tim Wilson is not a moderate. And that is a topic for an entirely different day, week, month, who knows. But Tim Wilson, I will accept that he has won simply by being there and being able to show up on parliamentary days.
And making it into the leader polls.
Yeah, the name being thrown around. Andrew Hastie.
Tricky Tim, as I called him in my piece last week. Tricky Tim.
Tricky Tim. Where's he polling against? I don't know, or I'm not sure. Because
they're all doing worse than I don't know.
Yeah. That's the standout candidate is I don't know. And
Rachel, how about for you? Who won the parliamentary year in your eyes?
Well, it is almost impossible not to say Albanese, given the state of play. But to offer a slightly different perspective, I would say, despite the fact he currently has no power in the Senate, David Pocock continues to win a lot of moral victories. He came out yesterday with a bill to reform, to give people the rights to their own faces, because currently it's not illegal to make deepfakes of people's faces, assuming they're not sexual. And also, I think it's worth noting, he won like an extreme number of votes in the ACT. He looks like he has that seat for as long as he wants it. I think he got more votes than either Labor or Liberal in the Senate. He has to run every election, because the ACT's two senators get re-elected every time. But I think he is there as long as he wants. And I think potentially next time he could take both spots one day. So yeah, swings and roundabouts. He has no power in the Senate, but I dare say he's going to stick around and he's going to have power in the next Senate if the numbers fall even slightly differently.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I would say that he would probably be my pick for winner of the year too. It seems that he is chipping away at the progressive brand of Albanese and Labor more broadly in a way that the Greens were once able to do, and for a myriad of reasons are not able to do right now in a very effective way. But I kind of see him as doing that job. I mean, the incredible clip of him getting into it with Penny Wong in Senate estimates over the gambling, the parliamentary sports lobby stuff. I mean, he just has a way, I think, when he finds an angle, and he's good at finding the angles of making Labor look quite bad on things. Like you said, he doesn't have any real power, but I guess maybe that's the way that he sees his role, and to be that sort of voice, even if it is somewhat of a lone voice.
Yeah, and I think it's impressive to still be managing to have that voice in the media, despite not really having a look into any negotiations on any bills. I think it's also interesting that he is able to criticise Labor from the left in the way the Greens maybe are not struggling to, but they're carrying a lot of baggage now and a lot of different perceptions of them that he, as an individual, is able to skirt past. I mean, he still feels fresh. And even if he's arguing many of the same things as the Greens when it comes to gambling, when it comes to the environment, he doesn't carry the baggage of the whole team. He can remain above the fray a little bit.
I actually have a theory about that. My feeling is that he, as a white man who has, who's one of Australia's greatest athletes and one of the Wallabies' best captains, is able to get away with a lot more than the Greens as a brand, but also now the very woman-led Greens Party is able to do. But again, we keep throwing out all these threads that are episodes absolutely in their own right. BK, Rachel, thank you so much for your time today, and also your contributions to Crikey, analysing politics over this parliamentary year. I've loved reading all of it, and I'm sure our listeners have as well. So thank you both.
Thank you, Crystal, and thank you for the wonderful work you do on this podcast.
If you enjoyed this episode of Cut Through, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating or review for the podcast. Crikey is 100% independent, which means your support powers our journalism.